Harold Mitchell sits alone on his front porch at Riverside Retirement Community, watching the sunset like he has every evening since losing his wife 3 years ago. At 72, he's made peace with living out his days quietly, surrounded by memories of the 50 years he shared with Betty. But on this ordinary Tuesday evening, smoke begins pouring from the apartment next door. Without thinking, Harold rushes toward the sound of cries for help. In saving his neighbor Katherine from the flames, he has no idea he's about to discover something remarkable. That sometimes life's greatest surprises, and even love itself, can happen when you least expect them. The smoke hit Harold's lungs with familiar intensity as he pushed through the door of Unit 7B. Muscle memory from 30 years of firefighting took over. Stay low, test doors for heat, control your breathing. His knees protested as he crouched, but adrenaline carried him forward. The retired firefighter's badge in his pocket seemed to pulse against his thigh, a reminder of countless rescues just like this one. "Hello? Is anyone in here?" His voice cut through the thickening smoke. The living room was clear, but orange flames licked up the kitchen curtains, spreading rapidly across the ceiling. A pot of forgotten soup bubbled angrily on the stove, the likely culprit. A weak cough answered from down the hallway. "Help, please!" Harold moved quickly, years of training overriding the arthritis in his joints. He found her in the bathroom, slumped against the tub. Katherine Reynolds. He recognized her from community meetings. Though they'd never spoken, she'd tried to follow fire safety protocols, getting low and seeking refuge where there was water. But the smoke had already taken its toll. "I've got you," he assured her, his voice steady despite the burning in his chest. "Can you walk?" Katherine managed a weak nod, but her legs buckled as he helped her up. Without hesitation, Harold scooped her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt. A flash of memory. Betty, on their wedding day, laughing as he carried her across the threshold, but he pushed it aside. Focus, survive, get out. The flames had spread, cutting off their primary exit through the kitchen. Harold turned toward the sliding glass doors leading to the back patio instead. Katherine's head lolled against his shoulder as he maneuvered through the apartment, keeping close to the ground where the air was clearest. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Harold's muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop until they were safely on the grass, well away from the building. Only then did he allow himself to feel the weight of his years, carefully lowering Katherine onto the lawn before collapsing beside her. "Stay with me," he wheezed, checking her pulse the way he'd done countless times before. Strong, steady, good. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "You," she managed between coughs. "You saved—" "Shh," Harold soothed, his own lungs burning. "Help's coming. Just breathe." Fire trucks screamed into the parking lot, red lights painting the gathering dusk. Harold watched the younger men spring into action, feeling the phantom weight of his turnout gear. Captain Jenkins, who'd been a rookie when Harold retired, spotted them and rushed over with an oxygen tank. "Chief Mitchell?" Jenkins grinned despite the situation. "Should have known you'd beat us to it. Some things never change." As paramedics swarmed around them, Harold caught Katherine's questioning look. He'd have to explain later about his past life, about how he'd earned that chief title over 3 decades of service. But for now, he simply held her hand as they fitted oxygen masks over their faces, neither quite ready to let go. The commotion drew a crowd of residents, their worried murmurs mixing with the crackle of radio traffic and the hiss of fire hoses. Harold's next-door neighbor, Martha, appeared with a blanket, draping it over his shoulders with grandmotherly concern. "Always the hero," she clucked, patting his arm. "Betty would be proud." The words hit harder than the smoke had. Betty. His chest tightened, but not from the fumes. Would she be proud? Or would she think it foolish, a 72-year-old man charging into a burning building? He could almost hear her voice. "Harold Mitchell, you magnificent idiot." "Of course I'm proud." Katherine's fingers squeezed his, drawing him back to the present. Through the clear plastic of her oxygen mask, he saw gratitude in her eyes, and something else, something that made his heart skip in a way it hadn't in 3 long years. "Thank you," she mouthed. Harold nodded, suddenly very aware of their joined hands, of the warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the fire. "Just doing my job," he managed, then corrected himself. "My old job," as the paramedics insisted on loading them, both into the ambulance for proper examination. Harold found himself studying Katherine's profile in the flashing lights. She was probably in her late 60s, silver hair elegantly styled despite the evening's chaos, laugh lines etched around her eyes. He'd seen her around the community but had never really looked at her before. Now he couldn't seem to look away. The ambulance doors closed, and Harold settled back on the gurney, still holding Katherine's hand. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them let go. St. Mary's Hospital hadn't changed much since Harold's last visit. The same antiseptic smell, the same fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, the same efficient bustle of nurses and doctors. They'd been separated upon arrival, despite Katherine's reluctance to release his hand. Now, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed while a young doctor listened to his lungs, Harold found his thoughts drifting to the woman in the next room. "Your O2 stats are remarkably good for someone who just ran into a burning building," the doctor commented, removing his stethoscope. "Though I have to advise against making a habit of it at your age." Harold managed a wry smile. No promises. He fingered the hospital bracelet they'd insisted on putting on him, the plastic cool against his skin. "How's Katherine? Ms. Reynolds?" "She's stable. Mild smoke inhalation, like yourself. We'll keep her overnight for observation. But she should make a full recovery." The doctor made some notes on his tablet. "Thanks to your quick action. Just happened to be there," Harold demurred, though the professional pride he'd carried for 30 years flickered in his chest. "From what I hear, you happened to be there for quite a few people over the years, Chief Mitchell. News traveled fast in small towns." Harold shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "That was a lifetime ago." A soft knock interrupted them. A nurse stood in the doorway, smiling. "Ms. Reynolds is asking for you, Mr. Mitchell, if you're up. For visitors?" She glanced at the doctor, who nodded. Harold found Katherine sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had during the rescue. The hospital gown couldn't quite diminish her natural elegance. Her silver hair had been smoothed back, and some of the color had returned to her cheeks. She brightened when she saw him. "My hero," she said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that sounds so trite, but I don't know how else to say it." Harold settled into the visitor's chair, feeling oddly nervous. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have—" "Don't you dare say anyone would have done the same," Katherine interrupted, surprising him with her intensity. "I saw my neighbors filming with their phones. You were the only one who ran in." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them. Harold studied his hands, weathered by years of work and age. Katherine's hospital bracelet caught the light, a stark reminder of how close they'd come to a tragedy. "I was a firefighter," he said finally. 30 years. Old habits die hard, I suppose. Chief Mitchell, they called you." Katherine's voice held genuine interest. "Tell me about it." And somehow he found himself talking. About his first day on the job, fresh-faced and terrified, about the camaraderie, the triumphs and losses, the way Betty had worried every time the alarm rang, but never asked him to quit. Katherine listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, drawing him out of the shell he'd built around himself these past 3 years. "Betty sounds wonderful," she said softly when he mentioned his late wife. No awkwardness, no pity in her voice, just understanding. She was. Harold surprised himself by smiling at the memory. "She would have liked you." The words slipped out before he could catch them. Katherine's eyes widened slightly, and Harold felt heat that had nothing to do with smoke inhalation creep up his neck. But before either could address the moment, a nurse arrived with Katherine's dinner tray. "You should rest," Harold said, standing perhaps a bit too quickly. I'll check on you tomorrow if you'd like." "I'd like that very much." Katherine's smile was warm, genuine. "Thank you, Harold, not just for the rescue, but for being here." Walking back to his room, Harold touched his wedding ring, a habit of 35 years. For the first time since Betty's passing, the familiar gesture brought comfort rather than pain. "What do you think, old girl?" he whispered. "Is it okay to feel this way?" The hospital corridor offered no answers, but somehow the silence felt less empty than before. 3 days after the fire, Harold was pruning Betty's roses when he heard footsteps on his front walk. Katherine stood there, holding an elaborately decorated card and looking somewhat uncertain. She'd changed her hair since the hospital, the silver strands now falling in soft waves around her face. She wore a simple blue dress that made her eyes seem brighter somehow. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, gesturing at his gardening tools. Harold set down his pruning shears, suddenly conscious of his dirt-stained hands. "Not at all. The roses can wait." He hesitated, then added, "Would you like to see them?" "Betty planted most of these." Katherine's face lit up. "I'd love to. I tried growing roses once, but they never quite thrived." "You clearly have a gift." "Betty had the gift. I just follow her notes." He led Katherine through the small garden, pointing out different varieties. "These yellow ones were her favorite, peace roses. They're beautiful." Katherine touched a petal gently. "You must miss her very much." The simple acknowledgement, free of platitudes, made Harold's throat tight. "Every day," he admitted. "But it's getting not easier exactly, different." Katherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. She held out the card she'd brought. "I wanted to thank you properly. I know you said no thanks were necessary, but—" She shrugged. "I'm an art teacher, retired now. Making cards is something of a specialty." Harold opened the card carefully. Inside, Katherine had painted a delicate watercolor of his rose garden, capturing the peace and beauty of the space perfectly. The message was simple. "Thank you for being there when it mattered most. This is—" Harold struggled to find words. "You're very talented." "I had good subject matter." Katherine's eyes roamed the garden. "You've created something special." "Here, Betty created it," Harold corrected automatically. "And you've maintained it, made it your own." Katherine's voice was gentle but firm. "That takes its own kind of creativity." They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sweet scent of roses. A breeze stirred the flowers, and Harold noticed Katherine shiver slightly. "Would you like to come in? I can make coffee or tea if you prefer." "Tea would be lovely." Inside, Harold busied himself with the kettle while Katherine looked around his living room. He watched from the kitchen as she studied the photos on the mantel. Harold and Betty's wedding day, family pictures, moments frozen in time. "Your daughter?" Katherine asked, pointing to a recent photo of Lisa and her family. "Lisa, yes. And her kids, Tommy and Sarah." Harold brought out the tea. Trey, another of Betty's traditions he'd maintained. "They live in Chicago now. Visit when they can. They look like a wonderful family." Katherine accepted a cup of tea. "My James lives in Seattle with his wife. Too far for regular visits, but we FaceTime every Sunday." "James?" "My son." A shadow crossed Katherine's face. "His father, my Robert, passed 6 years ago. Heart attack, very sudden." Harold settled into his armchair, noting how naturally Katherine had chosen Betty's favorite spot on the sofa. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." "It was. Is." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "But like you said, it gets different. Life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" Their eyes met over their teacups, and Harold felt that now familiar flutter in his chest. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Lisa's smiling face appeared on the screen. "Do you need to get that?" Katherine asked. "She'll call back." Harold silenced the phone. "Tell me more about your art teaching. How did you get started?" As Katherine launched into a story about her first classroom disaster involving spilled paint and an escaped hamster, Harold found himself smiling more than he had in years. The afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, and he noticed the way her hands moved expressively as she talked. From the mantel, Betty's photo seemed to watch them with benign amusement. For the first time, Harold didn't feel guilty about noticing another woman's beauty. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude for the life he'd shared with Betty and for whatever this new chapter might bring. The roses nodded their approval outside the window, their peace undisturbed by change. The old chess set caught Katherine's eye during her third visit to Harold's apartment. It sat on a shelf in the corner, a handsome wooden board with carved pieces that showed signs of frequent use. "You play?" she asked, running a finger along the smooth surface of a knight. Harold looked up from the photo album they'd been discussing. "Betty and I used to play every evening. She usually won." He smiled at the memory. "Do you?" "I was club champion at my high school, which was about 1,000,000 years ago." Katherine's eyes twinkled. "Want to find out if I still remember how the pieces move?" That was how their evening ritual began. They would meet in the community room after dinner, the chess set between them, cups of tea growing cold as they concentrated on their moves. Harold discovered that Katherine wasn't just good, she was formidable. "Checkmate," she announced on their first evening, eyes dancing with triumph. "Betty would have liked you even more." Harold chuckled, resetting the pieces. "She always said I needed to be humbled regularly." The games became a fixture of community life. Other residents would drift by, watching their matches, offering commentary. Martha from next door started bringing her famous oatmeal cookies. Tom Wilson, who'd lost his Sarah last spring, would pull up a chair and kibitz. "You two should enter the county senior chess tournament," suggested Alice Cooper one evening. "They have a mixed doubles division." Harold and Katherine exchanged glances over the board. Playing together as partners, it felt significant somehow. "What do you think?" Katherine asked, moving her bishop. "We could practice together." Before Harold could respond, his phone buzzed. Lisa's number again. He'd been avoiding her calls since that first afternoon with Katherine, unsure how to explain these new developments in his life. "You should answer it," Katherine said softly. "She'll be worried." Harold nodded and stepped away from the table. "Hi, sweetheart." "Dad, finally!" Lisa's voice held relief and frustration. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Mrs. Cooper called and said something about you running into a fire. Are you okay? What were you thinking?" "I'm fine, Lisa. And now she's saying you're spending time with some woman. Dad, are you sure that's wise? I mean, it hasn't been that long since Mom." Harold felt a familiar guilt twist in his stomach, but it was followed by something new, a quiet certainty. "Her name is Katherine," he said firmly. "She's a retired art teacher, and yes, we're spending time together." Silence on the line. Then, more gently, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Harold looked back at the chess table. Katherine was chatting with Martha, her face animated as she gestured over the board. The evening light caught her profile, and something in Harold's chest tightened. "I'm not sure about anything," he admitted to his daughter. "But I think your mother would want me to find out." More silence. Then a sigh. "Just be careful. Okay, I don't want you getting hurt. I know, sweetheart, I love you." When he returned to the table, Katherine had already set up a new game. She didn't ask about the call, but her eyes held understanding. "Your move," she said simply. As they played, Harold found himself studying her hands as they moved the pieces, elegant, artistic hands that spoke of a life well lived. He noticed how she bit her lower lip when concentrating, how her eyes crinkled when she smiled. "The tournament is next month," she mentioned casually, capturing his knight. "If you're interested." Harold moved his queen, protecting his king. "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Later that night, as they walked back to their apartments, their shoulders brushed accidentally. Neither pulled away. The contact was slight, but it sent Harold's heart racing like a teenager's. At her door, Katherine turned to him. "Same time. Tomorrow, I'll bring my A-game," he promised. "You'd better." She hesitated, then quickly squeezed his hand. "Good night, Harold." Walking the short distance to his own apartment, Harold could hear the community room still buzzing with conversation. He knew he and Katherine would be the main topic, the widow and widower, finding connection over chess pieces and shared memories. For the first time, he found he didn't mind being talked about. Let them talk. Some things were worth a little. Gossip. That night, before bed, he took out Betty's old journal and wrote a new entry, something he hadn't done since her passing. "I think I'm ready to live again. I hope you understand." The chess set sat on his coffee table, the pieces still, arranged from their last game. In the moonlight, they seemed to stand like silent witnesses to the beginning of something new. The knock came just as Harold was contemplating another microwave dinner. He opened his door to find Katherine holding a covered casserole dish, the smell of home cooking wafting tantalizingly through the air. "I made too much chicken pot pie," she said, though her slight smile suggested this had been entirely intentional. "I thought you might like to share." Harold glanced at his frozen dinner, then back at Katherine's offering. "I think you just saved me from a fate worse than fire." Her laughter filled his kitchen as they set about preparing dinner together. Harold found plates, Betty's good china, which hadn't seen use in 3 years, while Katherine warmed the pot pie. The familiar domestic sounds stirred something in him. The clink of cutlery, the soft footsteps of another person sharing his space. "This smells wonderful," he said, watching her check the oven. "I haven't had a proper home-cooked meal since—" He trailed off, the words catching. Katherine straightened, understanding in her eyes. "Betty did the cooking?" She was amazing in the kitchen, had this old recipe box full of family secrets. Harold moved to a cabinet and pulled out a weathered tin container. "I've kept it, though I barely know how to boil water." "Show me," Katherine asked softly. They sat at the kitchen table, the pot pie warming in the oven as Harold began pulling out recipe cards. Each one was written in Betty's neat handwriting, with little notes in the margins. "Tommy's favorite, perfect for summer. Harold requests this every anniversary." "Look at this one," Harold said, holding up a card. "Her grandmother's snickerdoodles. She made these every Christmas. The kids would help, getting cinnamon sugar everywhere." Katherine took the card gently, studying it. "We could make these, you know, if you'd like to try." Harold looked at her, surprised. "You'd want to?" "Of course. I love to bake and—" She hesitated. "It might be nice, keeping Betty's traditions alive, if you think that would be okay." The lump in Harold's throat made it hard to speak. He simply nodded. The timer dinged, saving him from having to find words. They moved around each other naturally as they served dinner, as if they'd done this 100 times before. The pot pie was delicious, but what struck Harold most was how right it felt, sharing a meal with someone again. "My Robert was the cook in our family too," Katherine said, accepting a second helping. "He learned from his mother, this wonderful Italian woman who believed food was love." "What was his specialty?" "Lasagna. 4 cheese, with a sauce that simmered all day." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "After he died, I couldn't even look at Italian food for a year. Now," she smiled sadly, "now I make his lasagna sometimes, and it feels like he's in the kitchen with me." Harold reached across the table and squeezed her hand. She turned her palm up, interlacing their fingers. "It's strange," she continued, "how grief changes. At first, it's this overwhelming wave that threatens to drown you. Then slowly, so slowly, you barely notice it becomes something else. Not smaller exactly, but more manageable. The memories start to bring comfort instead of pain. Like cooking their recipes," Harold said softly. "Like cooking their recipes," she agreed. They cleaned up together afterward, falling into an easy rhythm. Harold washed while Katherine dried, the comfortable silence broken only by the clink of dishes and the distant sound of a television from another apartment. "Next time," Katherine said as she put away the last plate, "I'll teach you how to make Robert's lasagna. Only if you let me share Betty's snickerdoodle recipe." Their eyes met, and Harold felt that now familiar flutter in his chest. They were trading more than recipes, he realized. They were sharing their past loves, their memories, their hearts. "It's a deal," Katherine said, later after she'd gone. And home, Harold sat in his chair looking at Betty's recipe box. He could almost hear her voice. "Food is meant to be shared, Harold, like love. It grows when you give it away." "I'm trying, old girl," he whispered. "I'm trying." The recipe cards seemed to glow softly in the evening light, promises of future meals and shared moments waiting to be born. The flyer for the Riverside Spring Dance had been posted in the community room for weeks, but Harold hadn't given it much thought until Katherine mentioned it during their evening chess game. "Are you planning to go?" she asked casually, moving, her rook with deliberate care. Harold's hand went automatically to his wedding ring, twisting it as he considered his response. "I hadn't thought about it. Betty and I used to go every year. But since I understand." Katherine's voice was gentle. "Robert and I never missed one either. The last few years, I've just helped with refreshments." They played in silence for a few moves, but Harold could feel the unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Katherine spoke again. "We could go together, as friends." She kept her eyes on the board. "Sometimes it's easier to face these things when you're not alone." Harold studied his gold band, worn smooth by decades of wear. He remembered slipping it on in church, young and full of dreams, Betty's eyes shining with happy tears. Now it felt both like a shield and a chain. "I'm not sure I'm ready to—" He struggled to find the words. "Dance," Katherine supplied, "or move forward." Their eyes met across the chessboard. There was no judgment in her gaze, only understanding. And something else, a patient hope that made his heart twist. "Both, maybe," he admitted. Katherine nodded, then captured his bishop. "The thing about dancing," she said thoughtfully, "is that you don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing to try. The music does the rest." That night, Harold stood before his bathroom mirror, really looking at his reflection for the first time in months. The ring caught the light as he washed his hands, and he found himself thinking about Katherine's words. The next morning, she was tending her small container garden when he approached, 2 paper cups of coffee in hand. "About the dance," he said, passing her a cup. "If the offer still stands." Her smile was worth the sleepless night he'd spent deciding. The evening of the dance arrived clear and warm. Harold put on his best suit, the one Betty had always said brought out his eyes, and found himself facing another decision. The ring. For the first time since Betty's passing, he slipped it off, feeling the strange lightness of his bare finger. After a long moment, he took the chain from Betty's old locket and threaded the ring onto it. "Close to my heart," he whispered, "but not holding me back." He fastened the chain around his neck, tucked it under his shirt, and went to pick up Katherine. She answered his knock wearing a deep blue dress that made her look 10 years younger. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed his bare hand, but she said nothing. The community center had been transformed with twinkling lights and spring flowers. Martha waved from the refreshment table, and Tom Wilson gave them a knowing wink as they entered. Harold felt the familiar urge to withdraw, to protect himself from the gossip and speculation, but Katherine's hand was warm in his. "Shall we?" she asked, as the band started playing Moon River. Harold hesitated for just a moment, feeling the weight of the ring against his chest. Then he led Katherine onto the dance floor, taking her in his arms as naturally as if they'd danced together for years. "You're good at this," she said as they swayed to the music. "Betty insisted on lessons before our wedding," he replied, then wondered if he should have mentioned her. But Katherine just smiled. "Robert had 2 left feet, stepped on my toes all through our first dance, but he was so earnest about it I didn't care." They shared memories as they danced, their laughter mixing with the music. Harold felt something, tight in his chest, begin to loosen. When Katherine's head came to rest against his shoulder during a slow song, it felt right, natural. As the evening wound down, they found themselves out in the garden, the spring air cool and sweet. Katherine's hand still rested in his. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being willing to try." Harold touched the chain under his shirt with his free hand. "Betty used to say that love isn't a limited resource. that having room in your heart for someone new doesn't diminish what came before. She sounds very wise. She was. Harold turned to face Katherine fully. And I think she'd want me to dance again. Katherine's eyes shimmered in the moonlight. Then let's dance, Harold Mitchell, for as long as the music plays. Behind them, the band struck up one last slow song, and Harold led Katherine back inside, leaving the weight of the past in the garden under the stars. The leather-bound photo albums had lived on the top shelf of Harold's closet since Betty's passing. Now, hearing a car door slam outside, he pulled them down with trembling hands. Lisa would be at his door any minute. His daughter, coming to see for herself what was happening with her father. "Dad?" Lisa's voice, followed by a knock. "Are you home?" Harold opened the door to find not just Lisa, but Tommy and Sarah too, his grandchildren bouncing with excited energy. "Surprise!" Lisa managed a smile that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. The kids insisted on coming to see Grandpa. Before he could respond, Katherine emerged from her apartment across the way, heading toward her car. Lisa's eyes followed. Her, questions evident in her expression. "Is that her?" she whispered. "Katherine," Harold corrected gently. "Would you like to meet her?" Lisa hesitated, but Tommy had already broken free. "Are you the lady Grandpa saved from the fire?" he called out. Katherine turned, her face brightening at the sight of the children. "I am indeed. And you must be Tommy. Your grandfather has told me all about you." Sarah joined her brother, curious. "Do you really play chess with Grandpa?" "Every evening," Katherine smiled. "He's getting quite good." Harold watched as Katherine charmed his grandchildren with easy grace, drawing them out with questions about school and their interests. Even Lisa's guarded expression began to soften. "Would you like to join us for lunch?" Harold found himself asking. "I was just about to show them some old photos." Katherine glanced at Lisa, clearly reading the complexity of the situation. "I wouldn't want to intrude on family time." "Please, stay," Sarah grabbed Katherine's hand. "I want to see pictures of Grandpa when he was young." And so they gathered in Harold's living room, the photo albums spread before them. Lisa sat close to her father, while the children flanked Katherine on the sofa. "Oh my!" Katherine laughed, pointing to a picture of young Harold in his first firefighter uniform. "Quite dashing. Mom always said she fell in love with the uniform," Lisa said softly, then looked surprised at herself for sharing. Harold opened another album. "Here's your mother on our first date. The County Fair, 1968. Lisa leaned in. "I've never seen this one." Betty kept everything. Harold turned the page to reveal more memories. Their wedding, Lisa's birth, family vacations, ordinary moments made precious by time. Katherine listened as they shared stories, offering gentle questions that kept the conversation flowing. When they reached photos of Betty's last Christmas, Harold felt Lisa tense beside him. "We can skip ahead," he offered. "No." Lisa's voice was firm. "Mom would want us to remember the happy times too." As the afternoon wore on, Tommy and Sarah grew restless. Katherine suggested they all walk to the ice cream shop down the street, a proposition met with enthusiastic approval. "I'll catch up," Lisa said. "I want to talk to Dad for a minute." Once they were alone, Lisa picked up a photo of her parents' wedding day. "She was so beautiful," she whispered. "She was." Harold touched the chain around his neck, where Betty's ring still rested. "Katherine seems nice." Lisa's voice was careful. "The kids clearly like her. But I'm worried, Dad, about you getting hurt, about—" She gestured at the photos. "About all this being forgotten." Harold took his daughter's hand. "Lisa, look at me. Nothing could ever make me forget your mother. Katherine doesn't want to replace her. She has her own memories, her own lost love. We're just two people who understand each other's grief, and maybe," he smiled slightly, "maybe we can help each other remember how to be happy again." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "Mom would want that for you. I know she would. I just need time to get used to it." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful with your heart, both of you." Through the window, they could see Katherine walking with the children, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Tommy was talking animatedly, his hands waving as he told a story, while Sarah held Katherine's hand. "Some things are worth the risk," Harold said softly, watching his past and his possible future merge in the spring sunshine. Spring arrived in full force, turning Betty's garden into a riot of colour. Harold stood among the flowers one morning, Betty's old gardening tools spread out before him, facing a familiar dilemma. The roses needed pruning, the beds needed weeding, and his arthritis was acting up something fierce. "Need a hand?" Katherine stood at the garden gate, already wearing work gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. Since Lisa's visit, she'd grown more confident about dropping by unannounced. "I wouldn't say no," Harold admitted, rubbing his wrist. "Though I should warn you, Betty was very particular about her garden." "Then you'll have to teach me properly." Katherine picked up a trowel. "Where do we start?" Harold found himself sharing Betty's gardening wisdom as they worked side by side. "Roses need morning sun, afternoon shade. This variety likes to be pruned just above the five-leaf junction. Betty used to say, every rose has its own personality. You just have to learn to listen." Katherine proved to be an apt pupil, her artist's hands gentle with the delicate plants. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, Harold demonstrating, Katherine following his lead, their shoulders brushing occasionally as they worked. Robert tried to grow vegetables, Katherine shared as they tackled a stubborn patch of weeds. Built raised beds, studied companion planting. Everything died, except the zucchini. And then we had so much we were leaving bags of it on neighbors' porches in the middle of the night. Harold laughed, the sound drawing curious looks from passing residents. People were getting used to seeing them together now, accepting their growing closeness as natural. Betty's first garden was all herbs, he recalled. She'd read somewhere that they were impossible to kill. Managed to prove that theory wrong within a month, but she kept trying. "That's the thing about gardens," Katherine said thoughtfully. "They're all about second chances. Every spring you get to start over." Harold looked at her, dirt smudged on her cheek, silver hair escaping from under her hat. Something warm bloomed in his chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "Here," he said softly, reaching out to brush the dirt from her face. His hand lingered longer than necessary, and Katherine leaned slightly into his touch. The moment was broken by Martha calling from next door. "You two are putting my poor petunias to shame. Any chance you'd share some of that gardening expertise?" Soon they were giving impromptu gardening lessons to half the community. Katherine sketched planting diagrams, while Harold explained soil composition. Their audience grew throughout the morning, neighbors bringing coffee and questions in equal measure. "You should start a garden club," suggested Tom Wilson, watching. Harold demonstrate proper pruning technique. Harold said, glancing at Katherine. "We could start a garden club." Her smile was brighter than the spring blooms. Later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, they sat on Harold's porch, surveying their work. The garden looked better than it had in years, Betty's beloved roses complemented now by Katherine's artistic touch in the arrangement of new plantings. "Thank you," Harold said, "for helping, for understanding how important this is." Katherine reached over and took his hand, her gardening glove rough against his skin. "Thank you for sharing it with me. I know it's not easy, letting someone new into spaces that hold so many memories." Harold looked at their joined hands, then at the garden, where he'd spent so many happy hours with Betty. The flowers seemed to nod in approval as a warm breeze stirred their petals. "Betty always said gardens need tending," he said quietly, "just like hearts." Katherine squeezed his hand. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, surrounded by the sweet scent of new growth and possibilities. That night, Harold added, "A fresh entry to Betty's garden journal. The roses are thriving, old girl, and so am I." The piano in the community room had sat untouched for months. A layer of dust covered its closed lid, sheet music yellowing in the bench. Harold passed it every day on his way to meet Katherine for chess, barely noticing its presence anymore. until the morning he heard music. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the hallway, drawing him like a magnet. He found Katherine at the keys, her fingers moving with practiced grace across the ivory. She hadn't mentioned she could play. Harold stood in the doorway, transfixed. Betty had played this piece, not as skillfully, perhaps, but with the same loving attention to each note, the familiar melody wrapped around his heart, squeezing tight. Katherine looked up, catching his expression, her hands stilled on the keys. "I'm sorry, I should have asked first. I know Betty was a pianist." "No, please." Harold's voice was rough. "Don't stop." She patted the bench beside her, and after a moment's hesitation, he sat down. The piano. Keys seemed to glow in the morning light, holding memories of Betty's hands. "I found some of her sheet music in the bench," Katherine said softly. "She had wonderful taste. Chopin, Debussy, Schumann." Harold touched a key gently, producing a single clear note. "She tried to teach me, but I was hopeless." "Two left hands," she said. "Robert was the same way." Katherine smiled. "Tone deaf. As they come, but he loved to listen. Would sit for hours while I practiced." She began to play again, something lighter this time. Mozart, perhaps. Harold closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. In his mind, he could see Betty at their old upright piano, teaching Lisa her first scales, playing Christmas carols as the family gathered around. The melody changed, becoming achingly familiar, their wedding song. Harold's eyes flew open. "I'm sorry," Katherine said quickly, moving to stop. "The music was here, and I thought Betty played this every year on our anniversary." The words came out choked. "I haven't heard it since." Katherine's hands left the keys, finding his instead. "We can stop." "No." Harold surprised himself with his vehemence. "No, I need to hear it." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Her fingers returned to the keys, and the beloved melody filled the room once more. This time, Harold let the memories come. Betty in her wedding dress, radiant as they danced. Betty playing this song while pregnant with Lisa, her face glowing. Betty at their 50th anniversary, her hands slower but still sure on the keys. The tears came without warning. Katherine kept playing, giving him space to feel everything he'd been holding back. When the last note faded, she simply sat with him in silence, her shoulder pressed warmly against his. "I miss her so much," Harold whispered. "I know." Katherine's voice was gentle. "That's how it should be. Love like that doesn't end." "But it changes," he realized, wiping his eyes. "Like the music. The song remains the same, but we hear it differently as time passes." Katherine nodded. "And sometimes we're blessed enough to hear new songs too." Their eyes met, and Harold felt something shift inside him, like a door opening, letting in fresh air and light. Without thinking, he leaned forward and kissed her softly. When they parted, Katherine's eyes were bright with tears of her own. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Harold touched the chain around his neck, feeling Betty's ring against his heart. "I'm sure," he said. "Betty taught me how to love. It would dishonor her memory not to use that gift." Katherine's smile was radiant. Her fingers found the keys. Again, and this time she played something new, a piece Harold had never heard before. It was beautiful in its own right, not trying to replace the old songs, but adding its voice to the ongoing symphony of life. They sat together at the piano all morning, sharing music and memories, grief and joy, past and present, blending into something unexpectedly sweet. When other residents began drifting in, drawn by the music, Harold didn't move away from Katherine. He was done hiding his heart. That evening, he added Betty's sheet music to Katherine's growing collection, carefully, placing their wedding song on top. Some melodies were meant to be shared. Harold woke on his 73rd birthday to find a card slipped under his door. Katherine's artistic touch was evident in the watercolor scene she'd painted, his garden in full bloom, every flower rendered with loving detail. Inside, her message was simple but made his heart skip to new beginnings. "Happy birthday, my dear Harold." He was still holding the card when his phone rang. Lisa's number. "Happy birthday, Dad!" His daughter's voice held a warmth he hadn't heard in weeks. You free for dinner tonight? We've got a little surprise planned." "Should I be worried?" Harold asked, thinking of previous birthday surprises. "No, just be ready at 6, and maybe ask Katherine if she'd like to join us." Harold sat down heavily in his chair. "You're inviting Katherine?" "Well, yes." Lisa paused. "She's important to you, Dad, and after seeing you together with the kids, I think Mom would want us to make an effort." Before Harold could respond, someone knocked at his door. He opened it to find Katherine holding a breakfast tray with fresh coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls. "I'll see you tonight, Dad," Lisa said, knowingly. "Love you." Katherine set the tray down, looking slightly embarrassed. "I hope I'm not overstepping." Betty's recipe box had a note about birthday cinnamon rolls being a tradition. Harold pulled her close and kissed her, tasting cinnamon and coffee on her lips. "You're amazing," he murmured. "And you're biased," she laughed, but her eyes shone. "Lisa called yesterday about dinner. Are you sure you want me there? It should be family time." "You are family," Harold said, surprising himself with how right the words felt. "Or at least, I'd like you to be." Katherine's breath caught. Before she could respond, more knocking interrupted them. "Birthday committee!" Martha called through the door. "We know you're in there, lovebirds!" The rest of the morning passed in a blur of well-wishes and visitors. The garden club brought a new rose bush they'd all pitched in to buy. Tom Wilson delivered a vintage chess set he'd found at an estate sale. Even the young couple from apartment 3C, who usually kept to themselves, stopped by with a card. By evening, Harold's apartment was filled with flowers, cards, and the kind of warmth he hadn't felt since Betty's passing. Katherine helped him get ready for dinner, straightening his tie with practiced hands. "Nervous?" she asked softly. "A little," he admitted. "This feels significant." They drove to Luigi's, Betty's favorite Italian restaurant. Harold's heart clenched when he saw Lisa waiting outside. She looked so much like her mother sometimes, it took his breath away. But tonight, her smile was genuine as she hugged them both. "Katherine, I'm so glad you could come. The kids have been talking about you non-stop." Inside, Tommy and Sarah bounded over, fighting to show Katherine their drawings. Harold watched as she gave them her full attention, praising their artistic efforts with sincere enthusiasm. "She's good with them," Lisa said quietly, standing beside her father. "She is." Harold touched the ring under his shirt. "Your mother would have liked that." "I know." Lisa squeezed his hand. "I found Mom's old journals while cleaning last week. Did you know she wrote about wanting you to find happiness again? Said she couldn't bear the thought of you being alone." Harold's eyes burned. Before he could speak, Sarah called out, "Grandpa, Katherine's teaching me how to draw roses like the ones in your garden." They gathered around the table, family old and new blending together. When the waiter brought Harold's birthday cake, Katherine led the singing, her voice clear and sweet. Looking around at the faces lit by candle glow, his daughter's acceptance, his grandchildren's joy, Katherine's loving gaze, Harold felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Make a wish, Dad," Lisa urged. Harold closed his eyes, but for the first time in years, he couldn't think of anything to wish for. Everything he needed was right here. Later that night, walking Katherine to her door, he found the words he'd been feeling all evening. "Thank you for making this birthday special. Thank you for sharing it with me." She touched his cheek gently. "Happy birthday, my love." Yab. Endearment, spoken so naturally, felt like another gift, the best one of all. The emergency alert button, that small red device all Riverside residents were required to wear, had always seemed like an unnecessary precaution to Harold, until the morning Katherine didn't show up for their regular garden club meeting. He found her on her bathroom floor, conscious but confused, the alert button clutched in her trembling hand. His firefighter's training kicked in as he assessed her condition. Pale, sweating, pulse rapid but weak. "Already called ambulance," she managed, trying to smile. "Sorry to worry you." "Shh, save your strength." Harold held her hand, his own heart racing. "I'm right here." The paramedics arrived quickly, their efficiency both reassuring and terrifying. Harold watched them work, feeling helpless in a way he never had during his firefighting days. This wasn't a stranger in danger. This was Katherine, his Katherine. Blood pressure's very low, one paramedic muttered. Possible TIA. I'm riding with her, Harold said. It wasn't a question. In the ambulance, Katherine drifted in and out of consciousness. Harold kept talking, telling her about the roses that needed pruning, the chess moves he'd been practicing, anything to keep her anchored. Don't you dare leave me, he whispered when her eyes fluttered closed again. I just found you. The emergency room was a blur of activity. Harold found himself pushed aside as doctors and nurses swarmed around Katherine. He called Lisa with shaking hands. Dad, what's wrong? Katherine's sick. They're not sure. His voice broke. I'm on my way, Lisa said immediately. Which hospital? Harold sank into an uncomfortable waiting room chair, the same kind he'd sat in 3 years ago during Betty's final days. The parallel wasn't lost on him. He touched his wedding ring through his shirt, a habit that had become more comfort than guilt. Give me strength, he murmured, unsure whether he was asking Betty or God, or both. Lisa arrived with coffee and quiet support sitting beside him as the hours crawled by. When the doctor finally appeared, Harold stood on shaky legs. Ms. Reynolds is stable, the doctor said, and Harold felt his knees go weak with relief. It was a mild stroke, what we call a TIA. We caught it early, which is crucial. The alert button probably saved her life. Can I see her? Katherine looked small in the hospital bed, but her smile was strong when she saw him. My hero again, she said softly. Harold sat carefully on the edge of her bed, taking her hand. You scared me half to death. Now you know how I felt during the fire. She squeezed his fingers. I'm not going anywhere, love, not yet. Lisa stepped into the room, carrying a vase of roses from Harold's garden. These might brighten things up. Lisa, you didn't have to come, Katherine started. Of course I did. You're family now. The simple statement brought tears to Katherine's eyes. Harold watched his daughter arrange the flowers, feeling a profound gratitude for how life could surprise you, even in its darker moments. The doctor returned with a treatment plan and a list of lifestyle changes. Harold listened intently, making mental notes. He'd been through this before with Betty, but this time would be different. This time, he could fight back against fate. I'll need someone to help with monitoring her blood pressure, the doctor said. Family member or caregiver. I'll do it, Harold said firmly. Katherine looked at him. Harold, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He brought her hand to his lips. Because I love you. The words, unplanned but absolutely true, filled the hospital room with a different kind of healing. Lisa quietly slipped out, giving them privacy. Well, Katherine said, her eyes bright, it's about time you said it. 2 weeks after Katherine's release from the hospital, Harold found her studying a travel brochure at their morning coffee ritual. Her colour had returned, and her daily walks had graduated from the hallway to the garden path. But he still watched her like a hawk. Monterey Bay, she said, catching his questioning look. Robert and I always talked about visiting the aquarium there, seeing the otters. Never quite made it. Harold sipped his coffee, considering. He and Betty had been travellers in their younger days, crisscrossing the country in their old Chevy. After her diagnosis, those adventures had become memories to revisit in quiet moments. We could go, he said suddenly, once you're stronger. Katherine looked up, surprised. Really, you'd want to? I think, Harold chose his words carefully, I think it's time for new adventures. If you're willing to put up with an overprotective travel companion. Only if you're willing to put up with a stubborn patient who doesn't always follow doctor's orders. Her eyes twinkled. They spent the morning planning, the travel brochure spread between their coffee cups. Katherine's artistic eye was drawn to the coastal gardens, while Harold found himself excited about the maritime museums. We could take the coastal route, he suggested. Make it a proper road trip. Stop wherever looks interesting. Lisa will worry, Katherine pointed out. As if on cue, Harold's phone buzzed with his daughter's daily check-in. "Tell her with me," Katherine urged. Lisa's face appeared on the video call, concern evident. "How are you feeling, Katherine?" "Strong enough to travel," Katherine said, then waited as Lisa processed the implications. "Travel? Where? When?" Harold explained their plans, watching his daughter's expression shift from worry to understanding. "Mom always said your road trips were the happiest times," Lisa said finally. "She kept a journal of everyone." "I know." Harold touched his chest where Betty's ring rested. "That's partly why this feels right." They spent the afternoon making lists and reservations. Katherine insisted on splitting the costs, and Harold found himself loving her independence, even as his protective instincts wanted to handle everything. "We'll need to get your blood pressure checked in every town," he fretted. "And you'll need to let me walk on my own sometimes," she countered gently. "We can take care of each other without smothering each other." The news spread quickly through Riverside. Martha brought them road maps marked with her favorite diners. Tom Wilson contributed a guidebook to West Coast chess clubs. The garden club presented Katherine with a travel journal for sketching flowers along the way. That evening, Harold called James, Katherine's son in Seattle. They'd spoken briefly during her hospital stay, but this felt more significant. "You'll take care of her?" James asked after Harold outlined their plans. "With my life," Harold promised. "Good, because—" James paused. "I haven't seen her this happy since Dad died. Whatever you're doing, please don't stop." Later, Harold found Katherine on her patio, plotting their route on a map. She'd marked potential stops with little artistic flourishes. Flowers for gardens, anchors for harbors, musical notes for places with piano bars. "James approves," he told her, settling into the chair beside her. "Did he give you the protective son speech? Nothing I didn't deserve." Harold took her hand. "Are we crazy, doing this at our age?" Katherine turned to face him fully. "Maybe. But I'd rather be crazy with you than sensible alone." The evening light caught the silver in her hair, and Harold was struck again by how beautiful she was, not despite her age, but because of it. Every line in her face told a story of a life well lived, and now they were writing new chapters together. "2 conditions," he said, squeezing her hand. "1, we take it slow, follow doctor's orders. 2, we make it an annual tradition." Katherine's smile could have lit up the whole coast. "Deal," she said, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted of coffee and promises. That night, Harold added a new entry to Betty's travel journal. "Starting a new journey, old girl. Watch over us as we find our way." Packing for their trip stirred up memories Harold hadn't touched in years. Each drawer held fragments of his life with Betty, old ticket stubs, postcards from their travels, small mementos of shared adventures. He was carefully sorting through his bedside table when he found the envelope. It was tucked behind an old photograph, sealed and addressed in Betty's distinctive handwriting. "For Harold, when you're ready to love again." His hands trembled as he stared at it. How long had it been there, waiting? Had she known somehow that he would need these words exactly when he found them? "Harold?" Katherine called from the living room. "Do you want to take the chess set?" "Or to Harold?" She appeared in the doorway, concern crossing her face, when she saw him sitting on the bed, holding the envelope. "Betty left me a letter," he said softly. Katherine moved to sit beside him, close but not touching. "Would you like privacy to read it?" Harold shook his head. "Stay, please." With careful fingers he opened the envelope and unfolded the pages. Within, "My dearest Harold," he read aloud, voice catching. "If you're reading this, it means 2 things. I'm no longer with you, and you've finally found someone who makes your heart want to dance again." Katherine's hand found his, anchoring him as he continued. "I know you, my love. I know you'll feel guilty about this, like it's some betrayal of what we shared. But our love was too big, too real to be diminished by you finding happiness again. In fact, it's because of our love that I know you still have so much to give." Harold had to pause, tears blurring the words. Katherine's thumb traced gentle circles on his palm. I've had a wonderful life with you, Harold Mitchell. 50 years of adventures, challenges, joy, and growth. You taught me what real partnership means, how to face life's storms together, how to laugh even when things are hard. These are gifts that shouldn't end with me. So when you find her, this woman who makes you smile again, please don't hold back. Don't let guilt or fear keep you from embracing this new chapter. Love isn't a finite resource that runs out when shared. It grows, multiplies, becomes richer with every heart it touches. Tell her about me. Share our stories. Let her know she's not replacing me, but joining a continuum of love that makes life worth living. And know that I'm smiling down on you both, grateful that you found each other. All my love. Always, Betty. P.S. Make sure she knows about your tendency to leave wet towels on the bathroom floor. Some battles I'm happy to pass on. Harold laughed through his tears at the postscript. So perfectly, Betty. Katherine was crying, too, but smiling. She was remarkable, Katherine said softly. She was. Harold carefully folded the letter. And she was right, about everything. He turned to face Katherine fully. I've been keeping one foot in the past, afraid that moving forward meant leaving Betty behind, but she knew. She knew it was possible to hold both loves in your heart. Both different, Katherine said. Both real, both precious. Harold touched the ring on its chain, then slowly lifted it over his head. He studied it for a long moment before carefully placing it in his drawer beside Betty's letter. Are you sure? Katherine asked. Yes. Harold took her hands in his. Betty will always be part of me, but I don't need to wear the ring to honor her memory. She's in every kindness I learned from her, every lesson about love she taught me, including this one, that it's okay to love deeply, wholly, again. Katherine leaned forward until their foreheads touched. Thank you for sharing her letter with me, for sharing your heart. Thank you for being patient while I figured it all out. They held each other as the afternoon light painted shadows on the wall. Eventually, Katherine picked up the travel brochure from the bedside table. She'd love this trip we're planning, she said. All those gardens to visit. She would. Harold smiled. Maybe we can plant something special when we get back. A memorial garden, but for celebration rather than mourning. I'd like that. They returned to packing, but something had shifted. Harold felt lighter, as if Betty's letter had given him permission to fully embrace this new love while keeping their precious memories intact. That night, he wrote 2 entries, one in Betty's journal, one in the new travel diary Katherine had. Bought for their trip. Different books, different loves, both equally true. Lisa arrived unannounced the weekend before their trip, carrying a wrapped package and wearing a nervous smile. She found Harold and Katherine in the garden, heads bent together over travel plans. I have something for you both, she said, holding out the package. Just don't make a big deal about it, okay? Harold unwrapped it carefully to reveal a high-end digital camera. Katherine gasped softly beside him. For the trip, Lisa explained, and after. I thought, well, we should have pictures of this chapter too. New memories to go with the old ones. Harold hugged his daughter, too moved to speak. Katherine wiped tears from her eyes. There's more, Lisa continued. James called me yesterday. He and Annie want to meet us in Monterey. If that's okay? Katherine's hand flew to her mouth. James is coming, but he's so busy with work. Apparently some things are more important. Lisa smiled. We thought maybe a family vacation? All of us? The word family hung in the air like a blessing. Harold reached for Katherine's hand, finding it already reaching for his. Tommy and Sarah would love to see the otters, Lisa added. And Annie's been wanting to meet Dad since you told her about the chess matches. Are you sure? Katherine asked softly. It's a big step. We're sure. Lisa's voice was firm. Mum's letter, it helped me understand. She'd want us to build something new, together. Harold showed Katherine how to use the camera, delighting in her artist's eye for composition. She captured him tending the roses, Lisa laughing with them over lunch, the play of light through the garden trees. James says Annie's an amateur photographer too, Katherine mentioned. Maybe she can give me some tips. I'd like to meet this Son of yours properly, Harold said. Make sure he approves of your choice in men. Katherine laughed. He already does. Says anyone who'd run into a fire to save his mother has earned the benefit of the doubt. They spent the afternoon making plans for the expanded trip. Lisa called the aquarium to arrange group tickets, while Katherine texted James about meeting points. Harold watched them work together, marveling at how naturally their families were blending. We'll need a bigger dinner reservation, Lisa mused. 9 people, including the kids. 10, came a voice from the doorway. They turned to see Martha, eyes twinkling. If you don't mind one old friend tagging along, someone needs to document this historic merger of families. The more the better, Harold said, meaning it completely. That evening, they gathered in the community room for an impromptu celebration. Tom Wilson brought champagne, while the garden club supplied flowers. Martha shared embarrassing stories about Harold's early attempts at roses, making Katherine laugh until she cried. 2 new beginnings, Tom proposed, raising his glass. And old friends, Katherine added, squeezing Harold's hand. Later, as they walked back to their apartments under a star-filled sky, Harold felt a profound sense of rightness. Their love hadn't diminished any previous bonds. It had multiplied them, creating new connections, new possibilities. Penny for. Your thoughts? Katherine asked. I was just thinking about family, Harold said, how it grows in unexpected ways. Betty used to say that love was like her garden. The more you nurture it, the more it spreads. Wise woman. She was. Harold stopped walking, turning to face Katherine. And she'd love seeing our families become one. Just like I do. Katherine's smile in the starlight made his heart skip. Is that a proposal, Harold Mitchell? Not yet. He kissed her softly. But soon, when we're surrounded by everyone we love, watching the otters play. I like the sound of that. They stood together in the gentle night, planning their future. While the stars wheeled overhead, witnesses to love's endless capacity for renewal. The jewelry store window gleamed in the morning sun as Harold stood outside, Lisa at his side. Inside, rows of engagement rings sparkled with possibility and promise. Are you sure about this, Dad? Lisa asked softly. Harold touched his chest, where Betty's ring had rested for so long. The space felt different now, not empty but open to new possibilities. I've never been more sure of anything, he said. Your mother's letter. It helped me understand that loving again doesn't diminish what we had. It honors it. Lisa squeezed his arm. Then let's find the perfect ring. Inside, a young saleswoman approached them. Can I help you find something special? An engagement. A ring, Harold said, the words sending a flutter through his chest. Something elegant but not flashy. Something that speaks of new beginnings. The saleswoman's smile was genuine. For someone special, I take it? Very. Harold found himself telling her about Katherine, the fire, the chess games, the garden they tended together, about finding love again when he least expected it. That's beautiful, she said, wiping a tear. I think I have just the thing. She brought out a simple platinum band set with a single pearl, surrounded by tiny diamonds. Pearls represent wisdom and new beginnings, she explained. The diamonds catch light like stars, or like hope. Harold knew immediately it was right. It reminded him of Katherine's silver hair in moonlight, of the quiet elegance she brought to everything she touched. It's perfect, Lisa whispered. Mom would approve. As the saleswoman sized the ring, Harold remembered another jewelry store 53 years ago. He'd been so young, so nervous, picking out Betty's ring. Now he felt a different kind of nervousness, not the uncertainty of youth, but the sweet anticipation of choosing joy again. When are you going to ask her? Lisa helped him tuck the ring box safely in his pocket. During the trip, when everyone's there, you, the kids, James and Annie, all of us together. They walked to the car, passing the spot where the old firehouse had stood. Harold smiled at the memory of all the lives he'd helped save there. But saving Katherine that day had done more than rescue her. It had saved him too, in a way he hadn't known he needed. Back at Riverside, he found Katherine teaching Tommy and Sarah how to play chess in the community room. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening. "Where have you two been sneaking off to?" she asked. "Just running errands," Lisa said smoothly. Dad needed new walking shoes for the trip. Harold patted his pocket, feeling the ring box's reassuring weight. Soon, he thought, soon we'll write the next chapter together. That evening, after the kids had gone home with Lisa, Harold and Katherine sat in their usual spots for their nightly chess game. The pearl ring seemed to pulse in his pocket like a second heartbeat. "You're distracted tonight," Katherine noted, capturing his knight with ease. "Worried about the trip?" "No." Harold moved his bishop without really seeing the board. "Just thinking about how lucky I am, how sometimes the worst moments in life, like fires, can lead to the best ones." Katherine's eyes softened. "Very philosophical for a chess match." "Well, you make me philosophical." He reached across the board to take her hand. "You make me a lot of things I thought I'd never be again." "Like what?" "Happy, hopeful." He squeezed her fingers. "In love." The ring waited in his pocket. There. Families waited to come together, and the future waited to unfold. For now, though, Harold was content to sit with Katherine in the gentle evening light, playing chess and counting the days, until he could ask the question his heart had already answered. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, Betty's roses blooming as if they knew the importance of the day. Harold stood at his window, watching the garden club members making final preparations in the courtyard below. Martha directed the placement of chairs with military precision, while Tom Wilson fussed with the flower arrangements. "Dad?" Lisa appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her pale blue sundress. "Everything okay?" "Perfect." Harold adjusted his tie. New, a gift from James during their Monterey trip. Just remembering another wedding morning, long ago. "Mom would love all this." Lisa helped him with his boutonniere, a single peace rose, Betty's favorite, especially the garden setting. "She would." Harold touched the letter in his pocket, the one he'd found before their trip. "She knew before any of us that love grows best in well-tended gardens." The proposal at the aquarium had gone exactly as planned. While the otters played behind the glass, surrounded by both their families, Harold had gotten down on one knee, with James's helping hand, and offered Katherine the pearl ring. Her yes had been immediate, joyful, and witnessed by cheering tourists and seemingly appreciative otters. Now, 2 months later, their families had gathered again. Harold watched through the window as Tommy and Sarah scattered rose petals along the garden path, supervised by their new friend Annie, James's wife. The photographer, a gift from both Lisa and James, captured every moment. A knock at the door revealed Martha, beaming. "She's ready when you are." Harold took one last look in the mirror. At 73, he was about to become a husband again. The thought filled him not with anxiety, but with a profound sense of gratitude. The garden had never looked more beautiful. The archway was wound with roses and morning glories, Katherine's artistic touch evident in every detail. The chairs were filled with their closest friends and family, the garden club, the chess club, their children and grandchildren. Harold took his place under the archway, where the local judge, a regular victim of Katherine's chess strategies, waited with a knowing smile. The small ensemble began playing, and Harold turned to watch Katherine approach on James's arm. She wore a simple dress in soft blue, her silver hair crowned with a wreath of tiny roses. In her hands she carried a bouquet that combined flowers from both their gardens. But it was her smile that took Harold's breath away, radiant, confident, full of love. James kissed his mother's cheek before placing her hand in Harold's. They had chosen to write their own vows, simple words that spoke of mature love and second chances. "Katherine," Harold began, his voice steady, "life taught me that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms, grows, finds new ways to bloom. You showed me that the heart's garden always has room for new flowers alongside cherished memories. I promise to tend our love as carefully as we tend our roses, to face life's seasons together, and to thank every day for the miracle of finding you." Katherine squeezed his hands, tears sparkling in her eyes. "Harold, You ran into fire to save me, but you did so much more than rescue me that day. You showed me that courage comes in many forms, the courage to risk, to love, to begin again. I promise to be your partner in all of life's adventures, to honor the past while celebrating our present, and to grow old with you in our garden of second chances." The judge pronounced them husband and wife, and their first kiss as a married couple was accompanied by cheers, applause, and the enthusiastic ringing of the bell that Tom Wilson had salvaged from the old firehouse. At the small reception that followed, Lisa raised her glass. "To love's endless capacity to surprise us, and to two people brave enough to embrace that surprise. To family," James added, "in all its beautiful blended forms. To gardens," Martha chimed in with a wink, "and the love that grows in them." Harold and Katherine swayed to their first dance on the lawn, surrounded by roses and loved ones. Above them, the late summer sun painted the sky in shades of promise. "Happy," Katherine whispered against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible," Harold replied, holding his new wife close as they danced into their shared future. 1 year later, Harold and Katherine's garden had evolved into something extraordinary. Betty's roses now mingled with Katherine's artistic additions, climbing clematis, fragrant lavender, and whimsical sculptures created in her new pottery. Studio. The garden club met there regularly, and their blend of traditional and contemporary gardening techniques had won recognition in the local paper. On their first wedding anniversary, the garden hosted another celebration. Tommy and Sarah darted between guests, showing off their chess skills to anyone who would play. Lisa and James chatted by the punch bowl, comparing notes on their parents' latest adventures. The photograph album on display showed highlights from the past year: Harold and Katherine at chess tournaments, family gatherings, their Mediterranean cruise where they danced under the stars. "Remember when we thought they were moving too fast?" Lisa mused, watching her father help Katherine set up the cake. "Now it feels like they've always been together," James agreed. "Look how happy they make each other." Indeed, Harold and Katherine moved through their party with the easy synchronization of a long-married couple, though their frequent glances and gentle touches spoke of romance undimmed by time. They'd found a rhythm to their life together, balancing independence with partnership, past with present. "A toast," Tom Wilson called, raising his glass, "to the couple who proved that love stories don't have age limits." "And to the fire that brought them together," Martha added with a wink. Harold wrapped his arm around Katherine's waist. "Best emergency response of my career," he murmured. After the party, as twilight settled over their garden, Harold and Katherine sat on their porch swing. The gentle creaking accompanied the chorus of evening crickets. "Happy anniversary, my love," Katherine said, resting her head on his shoulder. Harold touched the small locket he now wore, Betty's ring on one side, a photo of Katherine on the other. "Thank you for this amazing year. Here's to many more." Inside the house, their merged lives told their story. Chess trophies shared, space with art projects. Katherine's paintings hung beside Betty's needlework. Photos old and new chronicled a family expanded by love. "I had a call from the fire station today," Harold mentioned. "They want us to speak at their retirement dinner about finding love later in life." "And will you tell them your secret," Katherine teased, "about running into burning buildings?" "I'll tell them that sometimes the greatest act of courage is opening your heart again." He kissed her softly. "And that love, like your morning glories, blooms new every day." As stars appeared above their garden, Harold and Katherine Mitchell held hands in the gathering dusk, their contentment as natural as breathing. They had proven that it's never too late for new beginnings, that the heart's capacity for love knows no bounds, and that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from unexpected fires.